Section 13 of A History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 3, by Henry Charles Lee. Book 7, Chapter 1, Part 2. As regards cruelty, it is impossible to generalize, where in the earlier periods so much discretion was allowed to the tribunals, and so much depended on the temper of the inquisitors, who might be stern or humane. In the case of the obstinate heretic or of the impenitente negativo, there was no question. The law of the land and universal public opinion alike condemned him to the stake. But, in the wide sphere of the penitent heretic and of the numerous offences of which the Inquisition had cognizance, there was an ample field for the display of severity or benignity. Against the barbarity of a case like that of Isabel de Montoya, which had too many parallels, may be set the tendencies of the Toledo tribunal about 1600. In its reports to the Suprema at that period, there frequently occur explanatory remarks, as though to apologize for the mildness of the sentences, which indicate its readiness to temper its judgments, such expressions as, she was a poor and ignorant woman, she was simple and ignorant, she was spared heavier penance because she was only 16 years old, she seemed a very simple and a very good woman, recent baptism and drunkenness. Occasionally, in bigamy cases, involving scourging and the galleys according to rule, the omission of these is justified by the age or weakness of the culprit. Sometimes, but not often, the suffering which the prisoner has endured during the prolonged imprisonment is taken into consideration, and is admitted as part of the punishment. This tendency towards mercy becomes more marked in the period of decadence, when the humanitarian development of the age made itself felt even in the Inquisition, and it offers a suggestive contrast to the savage fanaticism of the secular courts of the land which claimed to be more enlightened than Spain. In 1765 a wooden crucifix on the bridge of Abbeville was mutilated, and the Bishop of Amiens published a monitoire ordering, under pain of excommunication, any one having knowledge of the matter to denounce the offender. Duval de Saucourt, a councillor in the court of Abbeville, who was inimical to the Abbess of Villancourt, accused her nephew, the Chevalier de la Barre, a youth of 19. The only evidence was that he had once passed a procession without lifting his hat, that he had talked against the Eucharist and had sung impious and licentious songs. He was doubtless irreligious and debauched, and his evil reputation sufficed, in the court of Abbeville, to justify a sentence of amputating his tongue and right hand and burning him alive. Appeal was made to the Parlement of Paris, which, by a vote of 15 to 10, confirmed the sentence, with the mitigation of beheading before concremation, and this was duly executed July 1, 1766. The annals of the Spanish Inquisition offer nothing more hideous than this, and the comparison is the more instructive in that its penalty for sacrilegiously outraging an image of Christ, the Virgin, or the saints, with aggravating circumstances, was merely appearance in an auto de fe with the insignia of a blasphemer, abjuration de levi, and 100 lashes or vergiienza or exile, according to the character of the offence and of the culprit. The Inquisition boasted that it was no respecter of persons and, in one point at least, its rules offer a favorable contrast to those of the secular law. In Spanish law the privileges of gentility were fully recognized, and for many crimes the penalties assigned to gentle blood were much milder than those inflicted on the commonalty. This was reversed in the Inquisition, where it was prescribed that, in matters of faith, nobles should be punished more severely than plebeians. This was doubtless owing to the assumption that they were more intelligently trained and less exposed to error, besides the fact that their example was more impressive. On the other hand, however, the clergy, for whom less excuse could be found, were treated with much greater leniency than the laity and, far from being utilized as examples, their frailties and errors were shielded as much as possible from public view, in order not to diminish popular reverence for the Church. The penal resources of the Inquisition, as we shall see, were endless. While, for certain well defined offences, certain penalties were customary, the discretion of the consultas de fe was bound by no definite limitations as to what were known as penas extraordinarias, and they could devise whatever seemed appropriate to special cases. Infinite gradations and intricate combinations were resorted to in the effort to fit the penalty to the offence of each individual, and also doubtless often to secure unanimity in the consulta de fe, so that not infrequently there are 6 or 8 separate and distinct inflictions in a single sentence. It would be too much to expect that, in so composite an institution, during more than 3 centuries of existence, there should have been strict consistency in the exercise of this discretional power, but, making allowance for the infirmities of human nature under the temptation of irresponsibility, it can scarce be said that it habitually abused its authority, according to the barbarous standard of the times, except in the infliction of pecuniary penalties on which its finances depended, and in the vindication of its authority against all who dared to question its supremacy. It was callous to the sufferings of those whom it prejudged as guilty; it devised the most atrocious formulas of procedure; but, when it had secured confession or conviction, it was not systematically and ferociously cruel as has so often been asserted. As regards the enforcement of the sentence, it is to be observed that the penalties divide themselves into 2 classes. Some, such as relaxation, confiscation, fines, scourging, the galleys, reconciliation and abjuration, were within the power of the tribunal; others, like imprisonment, the sanbenito, exile and reclusion, depended to a greater or less degree on the will or the fears of the penitent. Theoretically, as we have seen, punishment was regarded as penance, voluntarily accepted by the penitent for the salvation of his soul, but the Inquisition, unlike the father confessor, did not rely wholly on the penitential ardor of the sinner. Punishment retained enough of the character of penance to justify the theologian in treating its non-performance as a proof that repentance had been feigned, and that the offender had relapsed into heresy, the penalty for which, under the canons, was death by fire without trial. In the earlier time this was enforced in so far as was possible. Thus, in 1486, at Saragossa, Rodrigo de Gris, who had been condemned to perpetual imprisonment in a designated house, with the penalty of relapse for leaving it, escaped and was burnt in effigy as a relapsed, and, in 1487, Cristoval Gelva, of whom the hospital of Nuestra Senora de la Gracia was assigned as a perpetual prison, was burnt in effigy for escaping. This continued for some time to be the theory, but in practice, while summoning the fugitive as an impenitent relapsed, to appear for judgement, it was deemed safer to proceed against him in the ordinary way in absentia, waiting for a year and prosecuting him for contumacy. Such a case appears to be that of Bartolome Gallego, who escaped in 1525 from the penitential prison of Toledo, and was condemned to relaxation in effigy, November 3, 1527. Some 40 years later, Pablo Garcia explains that the suspicion arising from flight, joined with that of remaining under excommunication for a year, afforded sufficient proof for declaring a fugitive a relapsed heretic and relaxing his effigy. It was only when evidence could be had of subsequent acts of heresy that direct proceedings for relapse were justified, and this was decided in a case where a fugitive was relaxed in effigy, and the Suprema revoked the sentence and rescinded the confiscation. The theory of relapse was evidently giving way. Simancas tells us that, although supported by high authorities, it is cruel and false and not founded in law. The fugitive is impenitent, not relapsed. If he returns or is captured, he is to be heard, and if prepared to obey the Church, his flight only deserves an increase of penalty. How rapidly the ancient severity was disappearing is manifested by a case in Valencia, in 1570. Pedro Luis Verga was prosecuted for Protestantism on a vague accusation that, when studying in Paris in 1555, he had consorted with the dreaded Juan Perez, and had shared his opinions, for which he was reconciled and sentenced not to leave the kingdom. He disobeyed, and in 1570 he was heard of in Genoa, giving utterance to heretical opinions. Now this was a case of relapse as well as of non-fulfilment of penance, but he was prosecuted for contumacy as a simple fugitive. It was in evidence that the old rule had become obsolete when inquisitors sometimes prescribed in their sentences that the penance was to be performed under pain of impenitent relapse, as in the case of Juan Franco, condemned at Toledo in 1570 to 8 years of galleys for Protestantism, and of Juan Cote, by the same tribunal in 1615, to irremissible perpetual prison for the same heresy. Towards the middle of the 17th century, Alberghini gives the various opinions held on the subject, and concludes that of Simancas was commonly accepted. Cases of non-fulfilment were not infrequent for, as we shall see, the discipline of the penitential prisons was exceedingly lax. Any penitent could absent himself and then throw off the sanbenito, which was the customary accompaniment of imprisonment, but, although this was canonically relapse, such cases were treated with what in those days might be considered as mercy. Thus Diego Gonzalez, reconciled for Judaism at Valladolid in 1644, and condemned to prison and habit, was recognized in 1645 at Medina de Rioseco without the sanbenito. On being tried for this, the consulta de fe was not unanimous and the Suprema sentenced him to 100 lashes. It was the same with sentences of exile. In 1667, at Toledo, Francisco Lopez Rodriguez, who had been reconciled in 1665 and had already been prosecuted for non-fulfilment of penance, was tried for doing so again and was condemned only to 100 lashes and 2 years more of exile. So, in 1669, Juan Lopez Peatin, for infraction of exile, had only 2 years added to the original term. A curious case, however, in 1606, shows how penitents were expected to fulfil their penances. Gaspar Godet, a Morisco, had been condemned at Valencia to reconciliation, 100 lashes and perpetual prison, of which the first 8 years were to be passed in the galleys. After 5 years' service, his galley was captured by the English, near Lisbon, and he was set free. He ought strictly to have conveyed himself on board of another galley to serve out his term, but he seems to have imagined that he was released from his sentence. He quietly returned to his native Torre de Llovis and resumed his profession of surgeon. He was, of course, reported to the tribunal, which seized him in August of 1606, and condemned him not only to complete his sentence, but to undergo 100 lashes and to pay a fine of 200 libras, although the maximum fine that could legally be imposed on a Morisco was 10 ducats. The renewed activity of the Inquisition, in the early 18th century, seems to have been accompanied with a recrudescence of severity in these cases. In the Valencia auto de fe of February 24, 1723, Antonio Roguero was reconciled and condemned to irremissible prison and sanbenito. He escaped but was captured and, in the auto of March 12, 1724, he was condemned to 200 lashes and 5 years of galleys, after which he was to be returned to prison, but the inquisitor general mercifully commuted the scourging and galleys to 5 years of presidio, or labor in an African garrison. So, in the Valencia auto of June 25, 1724, Joseph Ventura of Fez, a Moorish convert, had been reconciled with 3 years of prison and sanbenito. He fled, was captured and, in the auto of July 1st, 1725, his prison was made perpetual and irremissible. Again he fled, to be again caught and, in the auto of September 17, 1725, he was condemned to 5 years of galleys, after which he was to be returned to prison. All these were cases of formal heresy for relapse in which the canonical punishment was burning. For offences less heinous, which inferred only suspicion of heresy, there was an occasional practice of including in the sentence a penalty for non-fulfilment of the penance. This was in every respect an arbitrary matter, concerning which no generalization can be formulated, for it is frequently impossible to divine why, in a group of similar cases, some sentences should carry this threat and some should not. This apparently objectless diversity is markedly exhibited in the auto of May 13, 1565, at Seville, where there were a large number of penitents thus arbitrarily differentiated. In the cases where the threat was employed, there was slender indication of mercy, for where exile for life or a term of years was imposed, the penalty for non-fulfilment was that it should be completed in the galleys. In one case, that of Abel Josis, for conveying arms to Barbary, the sentence was merely a prohibition to sail to Barbary, but a violation of this was visited with the galleys for life. It should be added, however, for the credit of the Inquisition, that it not infrequently made threats which it had not the cruelty to execute. Thus the tribunal of Toledo, on a charge of divination, banished from Spain a priest named Fernando Betanzas, with a threat of the galleys for disobedience. Not long afterwards the Bishop of Salamanca found and arrested him, and the Suprema, December 22nd, 1636, ordered the tribunal of Valladolid to investigate the case, after which the Suprema contented itself with deporting him to Portugal, and warning him that, if he returned again, he should be sent to the galleys. The case of the Augustinian Fray Diego Caballero in 1716 indicates how non-fulfilment of penance might convert into formal heresy that which was mere suspicion. For uttering unacceptable propositions, he had been sentenced by the tribunal of Cordova to reclusion for 4 years in the convent of Guadix. He fled from there and continued to repeat his erroneous utterances, for which the Toledo tribunal pronounced him to be relapsed in grave crime, and sentenced him to abjure de vehementi, to be suspended from his orders for a year, to perpetual deprivation of preaching, confessing and the right to vote and be voted for, to 10 years' exile from a number of places, to 4 years' reclusion in a designated house, where for 6 months he was to be confined in a cell. He was also to wear a sanbenito while his sentence was read in the audience chamber, and the next day it was to be read to the assembled brethren of his Toledo convent, who were to administer to him a circular discipline, and he was to forfeit half his peculium, and all this under pain of being held as an impenitent relapsed. What is noteworthy here is not only the severity of this long accumulation of penalties, but also the abjuration de vehementi, which rendered reincidence in the abjured errors a matter for the stake. Section 14.